You will be very surprised to learn what poverty did to Victorian mothers and children. We imagine the Victorian era as a time of elegant ladies, strict gentlemen, and lavish tea parties in luxurious living rooms. We see images of lace and silk, hear the clatter of horses' hooves on cobbled streets, and imagine a world of strict etiquette and industrial progress. But behind this glittering facade lay another reality, one that was grim and unforgiving, especially for those at the bottom of society. It was a world where poverty was not just a lack of money, but a stigma that defined a person's entire life from birth to death. For women and mothers from the lower classes, this reality was particularly cruel. They were locked in a cage of social prejudice, legal disenfranchisement, and exhausting labor. Watch the video to the end to learn how mothers were forced to make choices that would seem monstrous to us today, and why the most frightening place for a poor family was not prison. What if I told you that everything you believed about women's rights in the past is not true? Victorian society was built on a patriarchal foundation that was reinforced not only by tradition, but also by law. For a married woman of any class, especially a poor one, her legal status was comparable to that of property. The central concept was coverture, or husband's protection. From the moment she got married, a woman effectively ceased to exist as an independent legal entity. Her personality was absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property in her own. Any property she had before marriage or earned during marriage automatically became the property of her spouse. He could dispose of it at his discretion. Women did not have a right to enter into contracts. They could not take out loans, start their own businesses, or even file lawsuits on their own behalf. All legal actions were performed by their husbands. The wages a woman earned for her hard work in a factory or as a servant belonged to her husband by law. He had every right to take all her money. She had no legal means to resist this. Even if they lived apart, the husband had the right to forcibly return his wife home. In such cases, the police and courts almost always sided with the man. Running away from one's husband was considered a violation of his legal rights. The laws of the time did not recognize domestic violence as a crime. The husband had the right to use moderate corporal punishment on his wife for her correction. This gave men virtually unlimited power. This system made women completely dependent. Their survival, well-being, and safety depended entirely on the character and will of their husbands. If he was kind and responsible, she could live a tolerable life. But if her husband was cruel, lazy, or simply squandered all the money, the woman had absolutely no leverage. She was trapped with no hope of help from the law. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. Which of these laws do you think is the most unfair? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about the myth of the angel in the house? Victorian ideology created a powerful cultural image of the ideal woman, the angel in the house. This ideal prescribed that a woman should be the guardian of the hearth, the moral compass of the family, and a caring mother who devoted herself entirely to the home. Magazines, books, and sermons extolled the image of a woman who created an atmosphere of comfort, peace, and piety in the home. She had to be meek, submissive, and completely detached from the dirty world of commerce and politics. Her sphere was the home and family. This ideal was developed by the middle class and for the middle class. It assumed that the family had enough money for the wife not to work. Her only task was to manage the home and servants. For millions of working-class women, this image was not only unattainable, it was a cruel mockery. They had neither the time, the means, nor the strength to live up to this standard. Their lives were the complete opposite of the glossy picture in the magazine. A poor woman could not afford the luxury of being a keeper of the hearth. She was forced to work hard to keep her family from starving. The ideal of passive and gentle femininity was shattered by the harsh reality of factory workshops and laundries. At the same time, society applied the same moral standards to poor women. If her house was not perfectly clean and her children did not look neat, she was condemned for laziness and immorality. No one took into account that she worked 12 hours a day. This double standard created enormous psychological pressure. Women not only suffered from poverty and exhausting labor, but also carried the burden of guilt for not living up to the imposed ideal. They were doomed to failure in the eyes of society. The gap between the ideal and reality was enormous. On the one hand, poets wrote about women as ethereal creatures. On the other hand, thousands of women worked in inhuman conditions, doing the dirtiest and hardest jobs. Thus, the myth of the angel in the house served not to elevate women, but to reinforce class differences. It created a convenient image against which the poverty and suffering of working-class women appeared to be their own moral failing. But if the ideal was unattainable, what did the economy of a poor family actually look like? In the next chapter, you will learn about the hidden financial mechanisms that allowed them to survive against all odds. I will reveal the best-kept secret of survival for the poor. For the Victorian poor, there were no banks, credit cards, or overdrafts. Their financial life revolved around one central institution, the pawnshop. It was not just a place to pawn things, but the cornerstone of the entire survival economy. The pawnshop was to poor families what the bank was to the middle class. It provided quick, small loans against almost any property. Without this system, millions of people simply could not have made it from paycheck to paycheck. The lives of many families were governed by a weekly cycle. On Monday morning, the mother of the family would go to the pawnshop. She would pawn her best clothes, bedding, her husband's tools, or even their wedding rings. The money she received was used to buy food for the week. It was a desperate calculation based on the hope that on Saturday, her husband would bring home his paycheck. The items were not pawned permanently, but only for a few days. On Saturday evening, after receiving her husband's paycheck, the woman would rush to the pawn shop. She would redeem the pawned items so that the family could look presentable at Sunday church service. It was not only a matter of convenience, but also of preserving dignity. However, the interest charged by the pawn shop was extortionate. Every week, the family lost part of their meager income. It was a debt trap from which it was almost impossible to escape. Sometimes there were unexpected expenses. Then more valuable items were pawned: watches, furniture, anything that had any value. Often these items could not be redeemed. The pawnshop manager was one of the key figures in the neighborhood. He knew the financial situation of every family. His decision to accept an item as collateral or not often determined whether the family would have dinner that evening. This system was humiliating but vitally necessary. It allowed any item to be turned into cash, albeit at a great loss. The pawnshop was the last line of defense before complete collapse and ending up in a workhouse. This is what happened behind the closed doors of Victorian slums. When we imagine a Victorian house, we see multi-room mansions. But for the vast majority of the poor, home was just one room in an overcrowded apartment building or tenement. These buildings were often old and dilapidated, not originally intended to house so many people. A whole family of 6, 8, or even 10 people could huddle in one room. This room was their bedroom, kitchen, and living room. In such a dwelling, there was no question of personal space or privacy. All aspects of life, sleeping, cooking, birth, and death, took place in front of the whole family. This blurred all boundaries and created enormous psychological tension. Sanitary conditions were appalling. There was no running water or sewage system in such houses. Water had to be carried in buckets from a communal tap on the street, which was often located far away. The toilets, if they could be called that, were cesspools in the yard. Dozens or even hundreds of people could use one such toilet. This created a constant threat of disease. Due to overcrowding and lack of ventilation, The air in the rooms was stuffy and heavy. In winter, they were heated with cheap coal, which filled the rooms with acrid smoke. In summer, they were unbearably stuffy. The walls and ceilings were often covered with mold from constant dampness. The dilapidated structures led in cold and moisture. Repairs were almost never carried out in such houses. For the mother of the family, maintaining cleanliness and order in such conditions was an almost impossible task. Any attempt to create comfort was shattered by harsh reality. It was a daily and exhausting battle with dirt and chaos. High rents forced families to hold on to these rooms. Losing their homes meant the prospect of ending up on the street or in a workhouse. Therefore, people put up with inhumane conditions. But how could a woman run a household in such conditions? In the next chapter, you will learn about the titanic labor that went into simple household tasks. Daily housework in the Victorian era was incredibly hard physical labor, even for wealthy families with servants. For a poor woman who had no appliances, it was a daily grind. This work was invisible to society, but it took all her strength. The main task was to keep the fire going. The coal stove or fireplace was the center of the home. It was used to cook food, boil water, and heat the house. Keeping the fire going required constant attention and physical effort. Washing was one of the most exhausting chores. Laundry was soaked, boiled in huge pots, scrubbed on a washboard, rinsed in cold water, and wrung out by hand. This process could take a whole day and required tremendous physical strength. Buying and preparing food was also a laborious process. There were no refrigerators, so groceries had to be bought every day. Cooking had to be done over an open fire, in heavy cast iron pots. Cleaning a crowded room where there were always many people was a never-ending task. The lack of running water meant that any water for washing floors or dishes had to be brought in from outside and then carried back out again. Even darning and mending clothes took a lot of time and effort. Clothes were expensive, so they were constantly being repaired. By the dim light of a candle or kerosene lamp, women spent hours mending worn-out items. All this work fell solely on the shoulders of women. They were expected to do all this work, often while caring for small children or doing piecework for pay. They had no days off or vacations. This titanic labor was not considered real work. It was unpaid and seen as a natural female duty. But it was this invisible work that allowed the family to survive from day to day. Physical exhaustion was a constant companion for working-class women. Chronic fatigue and back and arm pain were the norm. Their health was undermined long before they reached old age. What if I told you that domestic hell was only half the job? Contrary to the Victorian ideal of the housewife, for most poor families, one man's wages were not enough. To survive, women were forced to work alongside men, carrying a double burden of paid labor and unpaid domestic work. Many women did piecework at home. This allowed them to look after the house at the same time. They sewed clothes, made artificial flowers, or glued matchboxes, earning pennies for their efforts. The working day of such home workers was irregular. They often worked late into the night to meet their quotas. Their homes were turned into small workshops, leaving no room for rest. Other women worked in factories, especially in the textile industry. Working conditions were difficult. Long working days, low wages, noise, and dust in the workshops. Women's labor was valued less than men's, and they were paid significantly less for the same work. Another common area of employment was domestic service. Girls from poor families went to work as maids, cooks, or nannies in middle and upper class homes. It was hard and humiliating work from morning till night. After 12 to 14 hours of hard work in a factory or someone else's home, a woman would return home. There, a second shift awaited her, cooking dinner, cleaning, doing laundry, and caring for children. There was practically no time left for rest and sleep. This double burden had devastating consequences for women's health. Constant fatigue, lack of sleep, and stress led to premature aging and illness. Their lives were an endless series of responsibilities. At the same time, society did not recognize their contribution. Working mothers were often criticized for neglecting their homes and children. They were blamed for the very problems that were caused by poverty. This system drove women into a hopeless situation. They couldn't not work because their families would starve, but by working they couldn't fully fulfill the role of the ideal mother and homemaker that society demanded of them. But what happened when the family lost even this meager income? In the next chapter, you will learn about the place that was feared more than anything else. For the Victorian poor, there was a place more frightening than prison: the workhouse. It was an institution designed to help the most disadvantaged, but conditions there were deliberately made so harsh as to deter anyone who could somehow support themselves. The main principle of the workhouse was less attractive. This meant that life inside had to be worse than the life of the lowest paid worker outside. This principle was strictly adhered to. Upon admission to the workhouse, families were separated. Husbands were separated from their wives and children from their parents. They could only see each other occasionally during short and strictly controlled visits. The inmates were required to wear uniforms. They were deprived of their personal belongings and names and addressed by numbers. This was done to break their will and erase their individuality. Everyone who was able to work was required to do so. The work was hard, monotonous, and often meaningless. The men broke rocks, and the women unraveled old ropes into fibers. Discipline was strict and reminiscent of prison. The slightest violation of the rules was followed by punishment, such as deprivation of food. The atmosphere was permeated with despondency and hopelessness. Being sent to a workhouse meant admitting complete defeat. It was the lowest rung of society, a mark of shame for the rest of one's life. People were willing to do anything to avoid this fate. For a mother, losing the opportunity to live with her children and care for them was the greatest tragedy. Fear of the workhouse forced women to take on any job, even the hardest and lowest paid. It was a powerful tool of social control. Food was one of the biggest problems for a poor Victorian family. The diet was meager, monotonous, and often of poor quality. The main goal was not to enjoy or benefit from the food, but simply to fill the stomach to satisfy hunger. The diet was based on the cheapest foods. These were bread, potatoes, oatmeal, and tea. These foods provided calories but contained virtually no vitamins or other essential nutrients. Meat was a rarity and a luxury. At best, a family could afford a small piece of bacon or cheap offal once a week. Fish, especially salted herring, was a more affordable source of protein. Vegetables and fruits were also infrequent guests on the table. They were considered more of a treat than food. Because of this, many suffered from chronic vitamin deficiency. Food adulteration was a huge problem. Merchants often mixed foreign substances into goods to increase their weight and volume. Chalk was added to flour, and used tea leaves and iron filings were added to tea. Milk was diluted with water, and various additives were added to make it white. Butter was often not real butter, but low-quality margarine. When buying food, the poor could never be sure of its quality. Cooking was primitive. Often, a family had only one pot in which they cooked everything. The most common dishes were various soups and stews made from whatever they could get. It was a constant headache for my mother to feed her family on the few pennies she had. She had to be incredibly inventive to make something edible out of the minimum amount of food. It was a daily struggle for calories. Poverty in the Victorian era was perceived not simply as an economic condition, but as a moral vice. The prevailing view in society was that people were poor because of their own laziness, drunkenness, or immorality. This perspective absolves society of responsibility for the existing inequality. Poor women were particularly subject to strong condemnation. They were considered bad housekeepers, incapable of maintaining cleanliness and order. They were accused of being unable to manage their meager family budgets properly. Charity, which was widespread, was often humiliating. Before providing assistance, representatives of charitable societies would visit the homes of the poor to inspect them. They assessed the cleanliness, order, and moral character of the family. To receive assistance, a woman had to demonstrate humility, obedience, and gratitude. Any sign of discontent or pride could lead to refusal. This put people in the humiliating position of beggars. There was a clear division between the worthy and unworthy poor. The worthy were those who found themselves in need due to circumstances beyond their control, such as widows. The unworthy were everyone else who was suspected of laziness or vice. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance and condemnation. Poor women lived under the watchful eye of neighbors, merchants, and charity workers. Their every move was evaluated in terms of compliance with strict moral standards. If a woman could not maintain the illusion of propriety, she could be deprived of her last support. This forced them to hide their problems and suffering. They were forced to lead a double life, maintaining a facade of respectability. Thus, in addition to physical deprivation, poverty carried with it a heavy burden of shame and humiliation. Women suffered not only from hunger and cold, but also from a constant feeling of inferiority in the eyes of society. Living in constant poverty, powerlessness, and hard labor inevitably affected the psychological state of Victorian mothers. Behind the facade of fortitude and patience lay deep emotional trauma. This was the price of survival that was not written about in books. Constant anxiety was their eternal companion. They worried about whether there would be enough food to last the week, whether someone in the family would fall ill, whether their husband would lose his job. This life on the brink of disaster wore down their nervous systems. A feeling of hopelessness was pervasive. Many understood that they would never escape this poverty. The lack of prospects and hope for a better future led to apathy and depression. The fatigue was chronic, not only physical but also emotional. Women simply did not have the emotional strength left to show tenderness and affection. They were too exhausted from the struggle for survival. The loss of children was common due to high infant mortality rates. On average, every mother buried several of her children. This grief, which seems unimaginable to us today, was part of their everyday life. Guilt also constantly haunted them. They blamed themselves for not being able to give their children a better life, for their home not being as clean as their neighbors. Public condemnation only intensified this self-flagellation. Their entire lives were devoted to survival. There was no room for joy, rest, self-development, or simple human pleasures. It was an existence reduced to basic needs. Despite all this, they continued to struggle. They found the strength to get up every day and continue their hard labor. It was their resilience and self-sacrifice that sustained millions of poor families. We see that behind the glittering facade of the Victorian era lay a harsh reality for women from the lower classes. Their lives were far from the romantic images we see in movies and books. It was a daily struggle for survival in a world that was hostile to them. They were deprived of basic legal rights, trapped in poverty, and condemned to exhausting labor. The myth of the angel in the house was nothing more than a cruel mockery, highlighting the gap between ideal and reality. Their suffering and their titanic labor remained invisible to a prosperous society. The story of these women is a reminder of the price paid for industrial progress and the prosperity of the empire. It is a story of resilience, self-sacrifice, and an unyielding will to live in the face of unimaginable hardship. Their fates are an integral part of history that is important to remember. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.